Hi, welcome to Pole 2 PPE. How do economies and societies interact? Competing approaches in political economy. In this subject, we're going to be looking at a variety of schools of thought in what's called political economy. And we're going to be studying the competing explanations that they provide of the relation between societies and economies. We'll be able to see and explore different theories about why some people are employed and why others are unable to secure the work that they need. We'll look at why economic activity takes place in cities rather than in rural and remote areas, and how economists have explained and made sense of that phenomenon as well as contributing to it. We'll look at why governments are unable to secure agreement on solutions to problems like climate crisis. And we'll explore these questions through a variety of different schools of thought and how thinkers in these schools of thought have attempted to respond to historical problems. What we'll show is that, in a nutshell, the way in which economists and political economists think can be viewed as responsive to historical problems that seemed particularly important to deal with in their moment in time. We'll compare the theories to show how these competing views lead to very different interpretations of what government should do as a function of the problems that the economists conceptualize themselves as having. And we'll get a sense of the very different ways in which economists have thought that societies should structure their economic interaction between individuals, families, households, firms, and so forth. So that's, in a nutshell, what this subject will be about. In this first week, however, we'll be turning to the question of what is political economy, and then trying to provide an overview of the subject as a whole, its structure, its logic, our approach, and so forth. So the plan for today is to quickly provide an overview of what our goals are in this subject, to consider what political economy is, to also consider why we might want to study political economy. We'll briefly discuss some key terms and definitions which will crop up basically every week in different ways, because these are concepts and terms that play a different role in the very different theories that we'll be discussing. Then we'll turn to how we will study the different theories of political economy, not just what political economy is, why we should study it, but how we'll study it in this class. And we'll notice that we'll take a historical approach to that study. A historical approach that looks at the context and problems that economists accepted as their own in different time periods. An account then that tracks the emergence of methodologies and theories in economics and political economy as responsive to those problems. And a third act of the analysis where we develop a critical lens on those theories and methodologies, asking questions about who benefits, who loses, and does it matter? Then I'll provide you with an overview of the subject, how we'll apply this historical lens and these different questions in each week, and the different schools that we'll study. And finally, I'll deal briefly with the expectations for week 1. So that's the plan. So our first goal really is to understand that a thorough grasp of the workings of an economy will really require that we understand how that economy works in relation to society, to social norms, behaviours, expectations, and also in relation to political processes and institutions. So as students know now who did Pole 1 PPE with Jessie and I last semester, an economy is not necessarily a market. Markets comprise part of an economic system. An economy is all of those various institutions that have a role in regulating the distribution of material resources in a society. So this is going to be closely related to society itself and how that society is structured. And it's going to be very closely related to the political institutions that exist in that society. Since the idea that that we're studying the economy through the lens of the interactions between economy, society, and political processes, this will in effect be our definition of political economy. Political economy is an understanding of how the economy, society, and political processes interact. And this being the case, our second goal is to explore important historical schools and how these schools conceptualize these interactions between the economy, society, and political processes. Our third goal is to show that these schools and theories themselves grew out of a perceived need to respond to particular historical problems. So our subject is in this way historically focused. It's we explore these methodologies and theories in political economy through the lens of quite precise and distinct historical problems, as these problems were conceptualized by the economists in question. And this means that we show how the economists conceptualize themselves as being forced in a way to focus on certain processes rather than others by the exigencies, the urgencies of the situation. A fourth goal is to consider what our own contemporary problems might be today, and whether and how past historical theories can help us respond to those. And finally, a fifth goal is to help you to contextualize mainstream economics as just one, albeit the most dominant, of a number of competing approaches to the study of economics. If I can put it in a nutshell then, really our most important goal is to understand how the economy, society, and political processes interact through the lens of studying the methodologies and theories developed by economists in response to the historical problems of their own times. That's our most important goal today. Not today, in the subject as a whole. So let's now consider the question, what is political economy? Let's first consider what is meant by the terms market, economy, and economics, so that we can use these concepts to try to help us understand what political economy is. So a market is normally referred to as a place, virtual or physical, where you can buy and sell goods and services. So eBay would be a virtual market. A physical market would be Preston Market, where you can go in person and buy fruit and vegetables with cash. Economy is different to market though. Market is a subset of a broader economy. Economy includes more than mere markets. The economy can be said to be all of the social practices that condition the possibility of producing, consuming and distributing goods and services. It will thereby need to include social expectations of behaviour, government institutions for welfare, the provision of education and health through the use of our taxes to fund public institutions, because these institutions distribute resources in particular ways. The economy will also include institutions to secure competition, households, businesses. It'll even include information technology systems that allow us to access different markets that would otherwise be impossible to access or even have, like stock markets, for example. It would include justice and the administration of justice through the courts, the police. We need to know that contracts are going to be upheld, otherwise markets in goods will not be as effective. The military has a role too in conditioning the possibility of producing, consuming and distributing. A military and an efficient defence force can protect a country's economic system from incursion from others. Then there's overseas and transnational institutions too, like international law, international agreements and so forth. All of these have an impact upon producing, consuming and distributing. So the economy is much larger than markets. Now, economics. Economics, and some of you are studying economics, will know that economics is often defined as a social science that seeks to grasp the laws or patterns that explain changes in production, in distribution and consumption. In economics, here you get to study microeconomics, which studies the choices of individuals and businesses and households at the micro level of agents of choice. And there's also macroeconomics, which studies broad trends between economic indicators, like between GDP and unemployment, and how these change in response to government activity or law or other forms of change or influence. So that's what economics tends to be understood as. So what can we say then about political economy? Well, there are certainly overlaps between economics and what we'll call political economy, and some forms of economics can certainly qualify as a type of political economy. But the study of political economy tends to be viewed as broader and more nuanced than economics. And it's because, as Frank Stillwell argues in the text that's the required reading for you for this week, political economy tends to be viewed as the study of the economy that recognises the interconnections between the economy, society, and political processes, and is thereby open to methodologies that try to grasp the connections between these in their detail, in ways that can sometimes be quite different to the methods used in mainstream economics. Again, there are certainly overlaps. It might be useful then to look at Frank Stillwell's article for this week and go into a bit more detail about how he understands political economy, to consider whether that's useful to us. It seems to me that there are two components to political economy. First of all, there's the actual study a nuanced and broad study of the economy and its intersections with society and political processes. And according to Frank Stillwell, the author of your required reading, the basic questions that comprise the study of political economy are: what is happening? Why is it happening? Who gains? Who loses? Does it matter? If so, what can be done? And by whom? I'd add that before even asking what is happening, we really need to begin with a definition of a particular problem that one believes is in need of a solution. And we'll see that that's what many of the thinkers involved in the schools that we will study today tend to do, implicitly or explicitly. So we need to ask, what is it that we are seeking to illuminate? What are the real world problems that we want to explain and resolve? And then we can ask, what is happening in relation to those problems? Why is it happening? Who gains? Who loses? Does it matter? And if so, what can be done? So that's the first way in which we can understand political economy, as a form of actual study, a nuanced and broad study of the economy in its intersections with society and political processes. So the second component is political economy as the study of the main methodologies and theories that have been developed to make sense of the relationships between economy, society, and political processes. And this is capturing the idea that political economy, how we tend to understand that term and that sub-discipline of study, political economy is not just the study of the relations between economy, society, and political processes, but also the study of the variety of schools that have developed in different historical periods. So what this means is that studying the relationship between the economy, society, and political processes today also requires a knowledge of how other political economists have historically theorized these interconnections in past times. So we need to do both. We need to be able to study the relationship between the economy, society, and political processes, but we also need to know the methodologies and theories that have been applied in past times to study these entities. So in sum, political economy is now not just the study of the relationship between the economy, society, and political processes, but also requires the study of the concepts and theories themselves and how elements of historical approaches might be helpful for problem solving today. And so our subject tries to do both. It tries to take a historical approach to understanding the methodologies and theories that political economists have used in past times to explain the relationships between the economy, society, and political processes, precisely so that we can ourselves study the relationship between the economy, society, and political processes today. So now we can get to the question of why study political economy. We might want to study political economy to have a better understanding of real-world problems and to propose solutions that make better sense of the relationship between markets, the economy, social structures, and political processes. We might want to study economy to secure an understanding of competing explanations and competing theories about a particular problem or state of affairs. For example, we'll discover in this subject that there are actually very different and competing explanations about what poverty is and why it exists and what we should do about it. We might also find it useful to cultivate an appreciation of economic theory, even mainstream economics, as responsive to particular historical problems and not as somehow separate from those problems or able to stand alone independently of those problems. And we might find this useful to the extent that it allows us to think through what sorts of theories might offer a better explanation or a better response than another type of theory. We might also want to study political economy to expose ourselves to approaches to the economy that are broader than a conventional mainstream approach. And hopefully for PPE students studying economics, you might find the discussions here helpful for you in your study, because it may push you beyond the constraints of the sorts of theories that you are deploying and applying. And finally, it might be useful to enlarge your toolkit and your skill set to permit more nuanced analyses of a particular problem, like poverty or like inequalities and so forth. We've already begun to talk about some definitions. We've talked about what we mean by market. We've talked about what we mean by the economy and how it differs with the market, and why the market is a subset of the economy. We've already spoken about the state and its intersections with social behaviours, the provision of goods and services through other means, not just through markets. We will find that we also speak a lot about capitalism, capital, labour, profit, rent, and so forth. So it might be useful to you to keep a notebook or an open document where you pop in the definition of these terms as you understand them, to produce a kind of glossary for your subject as you progress. That might be useful to you by the end of the subject to come back to as you read and as you progress through, to remind yourself of the different understandings of these concepts and terms. To this we can also add feudalism. We can add a division of labour between household and market. We can add comparative advantage. We can add a whole range of different concepts as we progress. So this is just to encourage you to perhaps begin an open document with some definitions as we go through. So we've now looked at what is political economy, why might we want to study it, and now we're going to look at how we will study it in this subject. How will we study these different theories of political economy? Well, we're going to modify Frank Stilwell's approach to suit our own objectives. You might remember that Stilwell's approach began with the question, what is happening? Why is it happening? Who gains? Who loses? Does it matter? If so, what can be done and by whom? And we notice that before we even ask those questions, it might be actually worth asking, well, what's the actual particular problem that seems to be in need of a solution? What is it that we're seeking to illuminate What are the real world problems that we're trying to explain and resolve? So what we're going to do in this subject is modify Frank Stillwell's approach to suit our own objectives. And we'll feature the following. We'll be going back to the different schools historically located in their own times to ask, well, what was the problem that these thinkers were trying to resolve? How did they understand the problem in their own terms? What were the real world problems that the economists were trying to answer in different historical periods? And then we'll be able to look at their response. We'll look at their methodologies, the methodologies that the economists proposed to study these problems. We'll look at the theories they developed in response. And we'll look at how the economists proposed to overcome the problems. What solutions and ideas for improving life they proposed. Equally so, we'll consider the situation more critically. We'll have a critical consideration of these theoretical responses. We'll ask who gains, who loses. Should this matter to us? And what elements of an approach might we wish to reconsider? So we'll have a three-pronged framework that we'll bring to our study of the different schools of political economy, asking about the problem as they perceived it, the responses they formulated, and our critical consideration of their theories and their approach. What our approach will allow us to do is take a historical, problem-oriented and survey-based approach to understanding the emergence of methodologies and theories in time. We've divided our subject into the key major schools that you would have already heard referred to in some of your other study and in your reading of popular culture and in newspapers. We'll look first at classical political economy, then Marxian political economy, then neoclassical economics. We'll look at the old institutional political economy, feminist political economy, Keynesian and post-Keynesian political economy, Austrian and neoliberal political economy. We'll look at behavioural economics. We'll look at queer political economy. We'll look at ecological political economy. As for classical political economy, we'll notice that in the 1700s and the early 1800s, classical economics emerged in response to cycles of impoverishment in agrarian economies, in a context in which aristocratic landowners enjoyed considerable power over feudal workers. Classical economists, and you'll read some, their original writings, including by, for example, David Ricardo, classical economists tried to improve agrarian production by analysing how to make the process of production in agriculture more efficient. And they also provided theories of impoverishment based on analyses of the relationship between the human capacity for reproduction relative to the capacities of agricultural production to sustain people. Theories of poverty that had political implications in advocating for these processes, the relationship between population and production, to take place in ways that would allow for social evolution. A euphemism for letting poor people die if they couldn't feed themselves. We'll find out that in the mid-1800s, as economic life changed from agrarian to industrial forms of organisation in Britain, we'll discover that Marxist economics emerged in response to the immiseration of the working class, which was increasingly acute under industrial conditions. So Marxian economists sought to identify how workers had been alienated from the industrial processes of production and how this might be overcome with worker ownership over the means of production. So a different interpretation of poverty and what to do to overcome it. We'll see too that in the second half of the 1800s, we see the birth of what's called neoclassical economics. Neoclassical economics emerged in response to, again, like Marxian economics, the increasing significance of new forms of industrial organisation as populations increased rapidly in urban centres in Britain's north. The first neoclassical economists sought to identify how people behaved in response to incentives, and they theorised that if families were left to their own devices in well-regulated markets regulated by laws to protect contracts and to administer justice and to secure national defence, then families would satisfy their preferences in rational ways in the newly emerging markets. The idea was that poverty would spontaneously be overcome as people voluntarily limited their families in accordance with how much they could earn. And the idea was that people do know what they want and they act rationally to get it. Interestingly, in this context, the neoclassical economists like Alfred Marshall defended a family wage, a breadwinner wage for the male head of a household, which we'll analyse later through the lens of feminist economics. From the 1890s to around 1930, we see institutional economists emerging in response to the impact of institutions and norms on economic behaviour in constraining and promoting certain behaviours and outcomes. And then from around the 1900s to the present, we'll consider how feminist economists emerged in response to experiences of domestic violence, sexual assaults and precarity experienced by women and children as a result of the rise in independence for men that followed from the male breadwinner wage. This wage was higher for men than for women because it was meant to support family life. We begin our study of feminist economics much earlier than Stilwell, who relegates it to the end of the late 1980s, because the late 1980s was when feminist perspectives became accepted by the discipline of economics. But we start much earlier in the 1900s because there were these writings occurring, mostly by women, and even though these concerns became lost to the discipline, they until the late 1980s, they are located historically in problems like domestic violence, sexual assaults and precarity that belonged to the changing industrial context. And we see this context still creeping its fingers into our present lives, obviously, too. So we begin that study from around the 1900s onwards. And we include earlier readings from the early 1900s that are described by some scholars as early materialist feminism, even though Stilwell doesn't include these in his reader. So then we go to the 1930s and 1970s to Keynesian and post-Keynesian political economy from the 1930s to the 1970s. And we look at how Keynesian political economy emerged in response to the Great Depression and to the increase in unemployment as families evacuated the Midwest Plains following the ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl crisis, when the food bowl literally turned into a dust bowl. So the idea was if one could strategically boost the demand for goods in an economy that was depressed through government-supported production, like construction projects and government-provided consumption subsidies and investments in the arts, then poverty might be overcome and economic activity would increase. How post-Keynesian political economy then emerged in relation to the rebuilding efforts after war will also be considered. When the destruction of capital across the European countries in the Second World War caused real problems in terms of how to support markets and to overcome unemployment and to secure employment, full employment. So we're now up to post-Keynesian political economy here. From the mid-1970s onwards, we'll study the rise of neoliberalism, neoliberal economics, which was a return to the neoclassical economics, in many senses, of the late 19th century. Austrian economics had already emerged from the late 1940s as a counter-movement to the Keynesian approaches that emerged after the Second World War, and in response to totalitarian governments in Eastern Europe. But it wasn't really until the mid-1970s that we saw neoliberal economics receive increasingly broader acceptance due to crises of increased unemployment alongside increasing inflation, a problem that people thought Keynesian economics was ill-equipped to respond to, and we'll track that debate as well. We'll look at how neoclassical economics then comes to extend into the study of how people behave in response to incentives, also known as behavioural or nudge economics. And then, since in our week on feminist political economy, from the 1900s to the present, we tracked how feminists brought to the discipline of economics concerns about the inequalities experienced by women and men in an economy. We need to consider from the late 1900s onwards how queer economics emerged in response to theories of gendered injustice that the early founders of feminist economics had developed, which obscured increasingly visible social problems experienced by families of non-traditional organisation and of diverse gender identification. So queer political economy developed in part in response in the late 1990s to problems that were identified in the conceptual and theoretical frameworks employed by the feminist political economists. And it lent itself to different ways of doing political economy that would deploy different categories and different concepts for analysis. And finally, we turn to ecological economics, and we consider how it emerged in response to the climate crisis and to environmental disasters. These are disasters that have arisen because of how governments, economists, societies, households, and businesses have treated the environment as a resource to be used rather than a constraint on behaviour, a constraint on economic activity, if we want to behave in sustainable ways that allow humans to exist in a biosphere. So that's the overall plan for the subject, where we really go through and we track the emergence of these competing theories of economic life and activity, and the development of very different methodologies and theories of economic life as a response to particular problems that were important in the different time periods of the economists or political economists. So that's the, if you like, the overall broad survey of what we're going to cover week by week as we progress through this subject. So as we progress through this subject, I hope you'll begin to notice the interconnections between the schools and how they develop different methodologies and theories in order to try to explain or respond to problems that had either been overlooked by other theories and methodologies, or in some cases had even been deepened still further by the sorts of policy approaches that particular approaches became associated with when those were implemented. So perhaps if you can, save this to file somewhere, this nice little summary of at least some of the intersections between the approaches that we'll study. And perhaps consider as you go through how you would have reflected those intersections. So in this first week, we've introduced ourselves, we've introduced the subject of our study, we've considered what political economy is, we've considered why we might want to study it, we've considered how we'll study it, noticing that we'll actually take a historical survey-based approach, which is oriented around precise historical problems as they were perceived by the economists themselves. That will be the basis for us to analyse the methodologies and theories that have been proposed in different time periods, whose vocabulary still continues to be used and referenced by political economists who study the economy today. And we'll also be able to bring critical perspectives to bear on those different methodologies and theories and ask ourselves whether their approaches and solutions were helpful or useful, and what other problems were overlooked, what other problems were potentially deepened by those approaches. And we'll get a sense of the ongoing way in which methodologies and theories develop in response to perceived problems. I hope in the end it will help you to develop not just an understanding of history and the emergence of theories and methodologies in history in context, but also a grasp of the tools that have been used in past times which continue to be used today, and a sensitivity and awareness of the need to look for problems that might have been overlooked in past times, and importantly today, and a humility with respect to the present and the sorts of theories that we prefer today or prefer to use, an openness to diversity and to the use of multiple tools in a diverse toolkit when approaching the problems that we have in our world today. So now, expectations for week 1. Please read the subject learning guide. Please read it carefully. It includes a schedule of the topics, the readings for each week, and the assessments. There's a full description of every assessment task on pages 15 to 21. Please also complete the reading for week 1. This is available through the library reading list for the subject. Head over to the library page to find that. Please listen to a pre-recorded lecture. If you've got to this point, you can tick this off. Try to do this each week before the Tuesday tutorial. I'll also provide a copy of the accompanying slides that you can use to make notes from. And the lecture will be up on the Friday evening, the Friday afternoon, the Friday evening, in time for you to listen to it before Tuesday morning. In some weeks, in 7 weeks out of 12, you'll have an opportunity to take a quiz on Monday on the readings. You need to do 5 out of the 7 quizzes. So you can either choose which ones you want to do strategically, or you can do all 7 and the best 5 will be part of your mark. That's one component of the assessment. But head over to the subject outline to check that out. And this week, of course, we will not have a quiz. We'll have a practice one in week 2, and we'll start for real in week 3. Attend your tutorial on Tuesday